Welcome on this absolutely beautiful May afternoon to the Washington History Seminar, which, as you may or may not know, is a joint endeavor of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and the American Historical Association's National History Center. My name is Eric Arneson from George Washington University. My co-chair is Christian Osterman of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program. We like to thank the people who make this event possible, the folks who are behind the scenes, engaging in all of the logistics to make sure that this comes off without a hitch. We have Pete Bierstecker in the back from the Wilson Center and Amanda Moniz from the National History Center as well. And with us this afternoon, we have Dane Kennedy, who's the director of the National History Center. We also like to thank those who support us financially to make sure we can put on the programming that we do. The Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, Schaefer, has generously underwritten this seminar for a number of years now. The Department of History at George Washington University also contributes, as do donors, anonymous and not anonymous, and feel free to join their ranks if you so choose. Next week's seminar is by Jennifer Mittelstadt from Rutgers, who will be speaking on the rise of the military welfare state. I would call your attention to books outside when we are done. You are free to pick one up and perhaps even have it signed. And if we could add something new, just caution you, if you've got cell phones, put them on silent, if you would, so that they don't go off in our discussion or the talk today. And now, Christian Osterman from the Wilson Center will introduce Jeff Herf, who is today's speaker.
Thanks, Eric. Good to have all of you here today. And yes, do keep those cell phones shut off, please. Delighted to introduce Jeff Herf, who I'm happy to say is back again for yet another book launch. We've had Jeff here before to launch his books, and he, of course, is alumnus of the Wilson Center. He, as most of you know, is Distinguished University Professor at the Department of History at the University of Maryland in College Park. He received his BA from the University of Wisconsin, PhD from Brandeis, taught at Harvard, Ohio University, and Athens before coming to Maryland in 2000. He is one of the country's leading historians of Germany, public intellectual, and author, has an incredible list of publications to his name. Let me just name a couple. Divided Memory, The Nazi Past in the Two Germanys, Harvard University Press, 1997. The Jewish Enemy, Nazi Propaganda During World War II and the Holocaust, again, Harvard University Press, 2006. And Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World, Yale University Press, 2009. That book we launched here some years ago. And now he's back with yet another new book, fresh from the archives, Undeclared Wars with Israel, East Germany and the West German Far Left, 1967 to 1989, published just this past month, or I guess copies just out now. We're looking forward to your presentation. Let me, just to add to the housekeeping matters, say that we do want to acknowledge, aside from our external co-sponsors, also the Middle East program. Some of you, I think, may have been reached through our Middle East program. The program is kindly co-sponsoring this event today, and we're delighted at that. With that, Jeff, you have the floor. Welcome back.
Thank you, Christian. It is that kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be back at the Wilson Center. I spent a wonderful fall here in one of the luxurious offices in 2007, and and thank you, Eric, as well, for the invitation. Growing older has its advantages. That things you want to do a long time ago, you finally have a chance to do. 38 years ago, I arrived in Frankfurt, Main, to work on my doctoral dissertation. before I came, I remembered, who didn't, that there were two Germans from Frankfurt who wound up in Entebbe pointing machine guns at Jews and Israelis. And I wondered how that happened. And when I got to Frankfurt in 1978, it turned out that one of the people, that actually both of them, had a lot to do with the West German New Left. That they knew people who subsequently had become very famous in West German politics, and that the fact that they wound up in Entebbe pointing machine guns at Jews had something to do with ideas in the West German far left. And then, in 1990, I was very struck, as I would imagine many of you were, when the first democratically elected parliament in East Germany since 1932 unanimously passed a resolution in April as the first act of this parliament denouncing East Germany's policies towards the Middle East. And then in July of 1990, a group of parliamentarians led by Konrad Weiss and then a man named Joachim Gauck, who subsequently became the president of Unified Germany, passed a resolution denouncing the Zionism as racism resolution that the East German government had supported in 1975. And as a historian of Germany, I wanted to answer questions that came up when I first thought about those events. So the core argument of Undeclared Wars with Israel is the following. Beginning in the years just before the Six-Day War of 1967, the government that called itself the German Democratic Republic, and that I'm going to refer to as East Germany, was an enthusiastic and eager participant in the Soviet bloc's antagonism to Israel. That antagonism combined famous public denunciations of Israel as a racist, colonial, imperialist settler state with secret programs of military training and weapons deliveries that were sent both to the Arab states at war with Israel and to the various affiliates of the executive committee of something called the Palestine Liberation Organization, including Al-Fatah, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and the Popular Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And I refer to those policies as an undeclared war. Undeclared because it was secret, the details were secret, but war because I'm describing policies which, if they had been successful, would have led to the destruction of the State of Israel and the expulsion of its citizens from the territory with untold numbers of dead and wounded, and that would have happened by force of arms. The familiar phrase, criticism of Israel, is a euphemism. It's an understatement and doesn't begin to capture the combination of propaganda and support for armed attacks on Israel that were central to these policies. East Germany claimed to be supporting a compromise and just solution to the Middle East crisis that would take place at a Geneva conference co-sponsored by the Soviet Union and the United States. But really, the East Germans supported the hardest line of the Arab states, most importantly Hafez al-Assad's Ba'ath regime in Syria, and the Palestine Liberation Organization at a time when the PLO was engaged in numerous terrorist attacks on Israel. Support also meant political warfare against Israel at the United Nations and the delivery of large amounts of weapons to the Arab states and the PLO, military training and technical assistance as well. For historians of the Cold War, these policies were parts of a contest between the Soviet bloc and the Western Alliance for influence in the strategically crucial Middle East. For we historians of Germany, they raise questions of how and why any German government, after the Holocaust, would support anyone who attacked the Jewish state. I've previously written about what Germans called Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the Nazi past. All West German chancellors grasped that there was an implicit 11th commandment of German history after Hitler and the Holocaust. It was a lowest common denominator of the meaning of coming to terms with the Nazi past. And one could express that 11th commandment in the following dictum. Don't kill any more Jews. Don't harm any more Jews. Don't help anyone else to kill or harm any more Jews, including the Jewish citizens of Israel. This moral minimum in West Germany was compatible with judicial delay, premature amnesty of ex-Nazi officials, and many years of public silence about the crimes of the Hitler regime. But no West German government, whatever its shortcomings in coming to terms with the Nazi past may have been, no West German government actually brought harm to the Jews, either in West Germany or in Israel. Bringing harm to the Jews in Israel is precisely what the East German government and the West German terrorists of the radical left did in the years from the late 60s to the end of the Cold War. They did so by becoming allies and supporters of Israel's armed adversaries in the Middle East. As a historian of Germany's confrontation with the Nazi past, I regard this still too rarely discussed history as one of the most important episodes of German and European history since 1945. Of the 15 chapters of Undeclared Wars with Israel, only 3 are devoted exclusively to the very famous West German leftist terrorist organizations, such as the Red Army faction or the Revolutionary Cells. In Germany, historians Martin Kloke and Wolfgang Kraushaar have done the pioneering and excellent work on the mix of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the West German far left. Kraushaar and his colleague Martin Yonder have been pioneers in examining the connections between the anti-Zionist rhetoric and the West German leftist collaboration with Palestinian terrorist organizations. I shed some new light, especially for an English language readership, on the West German New Left's turn against Israel in the summer of 1967, and the collaboration of the Revolutionary Cells organization that had its roots in Frankfurt Main with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, when together they hijacked an Air France flight to Entebbe in Uganda, and then at the airport in Uganda separated the Jewish and Israeli from the non-Jewish and non-Israeli passengers. I remind readers, or perhaps inform them for the first time, that their most important partner in Entebbe was Uganda's President Idi Amin, who gained world attention when he responded to the Black September attack on the Israeli athletes in Munich in 1972 by praising both Hitler and the Holocaust. I look closely at the convergence of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the texts of West German leftists such as Dieter Kunzelmann and Ulrike Meinhof. I document that the West German leftist terror organizations such as the Red Army faction and the Revolutionary Cells proudly declared their willingness to participate in the armed struggle against Israel. And all of this is familiar to people who follow West German events fairly closely. Yet the RAF, the Red Army faction, and the Revolutionary Cells, or the RC, merit 3 of 15 chapters because their several hundred members and thousands of sympathizers had little impact on the military dimensions of the Israeli-Arab-Palestinian conflict. They murdered 34 people, terrorized others. The people they murdered including leading figures of the West German political, diplomatic, and military institutions. And they found supporters in the leftist milieu around the universities, and they were functioning in a society with a free press. It's understandable that they dominated media coverage in West Germany in those years. The expertise of Ulrike Meinhof and Dieter Kunzelmann, in particular, did not lie in their military effectiveness. They were failures in that regard, though the terror they supported was real. Rather, they specialized in the acquisition of publicity by making outrageous anti-Semitic statements, equating Israel with Nazi Germany or Moshe Dayan with Himmler, and suggesting that the memory of the Holocaust fostered a false consciousness of guilt that stood in the way of developing a revolution in West Germany. Yet one perhaps unintended consequence of the enormous media attention devoted to the West German leftist terror groups was that on the whole, West German and Western journalists missed the story of the main assault on Israel in those years, the one coming from the Soviet bloc and in Germany from East Germany. Therefore, in Undeclared Wars with Israel, I shift the focus from who received the most media attention to those who were sending most of the military equipment and those who were allowing their country to be used to support attacks on Israel. And that took place in East Germany. There's another reason for this shift of emphasis. In contrast to the West German terrorist organization, as my colleague Arthur Eckstein has pointed out, The East German regime was a state with the sinews of power and of war that a state possesses. It had territory in which military training could take place. It had armed forces, a modest arms industry, a controlled press, embassies and consulates around the world, formidable secret police and intelligence agencies, institutes for military training, and government-controlled universities that offered ideological messages to young students coming to East Germany, and the Soviet bloc for that matter, from third world countries. As a result, East Germany and the Soviet bloc allies had a far more important impact on the conflict in the Middle East than did the more famous West German groups. With access to a variety of government and political archives in West Germany and to the archives of all the decision-making and implementation institutions of the East German regime, the decision-making Politburo, the implementation offices of the Council of Ministers, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Defense, as well as the Ministry of State Security, the Stasi, we are now in a position to offer evidence about East German policy that the regime had succeeded until it collapsed in keeping secret. Undeclared Wars with Israel draws attention to the communist ideological accomplishment, and one of their most significant accomplishments was to lend the moral respectability of global anti-fascism to the anti-Zionist impulse. Anti-Zionism had long been discredited in the decades after World War II because of its logical association with the Nazis. Though London's former mayor, Ken Livingstone, and other members of the British Labour Party appear not to be aware of the fact, Hitler and the Nazi regime despised Zionism. Allowing Jews to go to Palestine in the mid-1930s after robbing them of most of their possessions was not the same as supporting the formation of a Jewish state. In their view, a Jewish state would be yet another outpost of an international Jewish conspiracy, which they believed was waging war on innocent Germany. As I pointed out at length in my history of Nazi propaganda aimed at the Arab states during World War II, hatred of Zionism was an inseparable aspect of Nazi Germany's anti-Jewish propaganda. The Nazis wanted to kill the Jews of North Africa and the Middle East, and only the British, the Australian, and the New Zealand armies in the Battle of El Alamein, followed by the United States Operation Torch in fall of 1942, prevented them from doing so. The ideological accomplishment of the Soviet bloc and the PLO in the Cold War in that regard was considerable, and it has been long-lasting. It repressed the role of Nazi collaboration with the Palestinian leadership in the War of 1948. It falsely associated Zionism with European colonialism. It provided a huge multiplier to the Arab claim that Zionism was a form of racism, and placed the moral prestige of the language of leftist anti-fascism in the service of the attack on the legitimacy of the Jewish state. The pages of the government-controlled media, such as Neues Deutschland, New Germany, were filled with stories of Israeli sins and crimes, along with Palestinian Arab revolutionary virtue and political innocence. For a German government to have lent legitimacy to the suppression of well-known facts about the collaboration of leading Palestinian leaders with the Nazis was a stunning accomplishment whose echoes resonate in our own time. Now I'll illustrate some of these very general points with reference to some specific events, beginning with the Six-Day War of June 1967. 2 days after the war began, the East German Politburo of the Socialist Unity Party, along with officials of the foreign and defense ministries in East Berlin, considered the events. They decided to send weapons to Egypt, led by Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser, and to the Ba'athist regime in Syria, led by Hafez al-Assad. In so doing, they were following established policy. And by the beginning of April, before the war, East Germany had already sent 20 MiG-17 fighter jets to Egypt. In July, it sent another 30. In June of '67 alone, East Germany deliveries to Egypt included 35 Soviet T-34 tanks, 5,000 Kalashnikov assault weapons with 600,000 bullets, and several thousand other variations of the Kalashnikov. And as the really remarkably interesting reports from the analysis division of the Central Intelligence Agency that are evident and findable in the CREST files at the National Archives indicated, East Germany was sending about 3% of the weapons that the Soviet bloc was sending to the Middle East. So a small fraction, the overwhelming amount, came from the Soviet Union. And by the way, it's important to keep in mind, as the CIA understood at the time, that Mao's China was an industrial basket case and was sending a pittance of the weapons to the third world that the Soviet Union was. So while Mao was winning the popularity contest among Western leftists, it was really, as the Soviet leaders knew, the Soviet Union that was sending the vast bulk of weapons to guerrilla organizations around the world. On June 15th of 1967, Walter Ulbricht, the General Secretary of the Socialist Unity Party and the leader of the regime, gave a speech in Leipzig in which he expressed his support for the Arab states and denounced Israeli aggression. Although the United States was not in a formal alliance with Israel and had only given a very small amount of weaponry to the government of Israel before 1967, Ulbricht presented the war as the product of American imperialism. In the United Nations, the Soviet ambassador, Yakov Malik, compared Israel's surprise attack that began the war to the Nazis' attack on the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front of June 22nd of 1941. Ulbricht offered his own comparison of Israel to Nazi Germany. With allusions to the protectorate in Czechoslovakia and the general government of occupied Poland, he said the world could not accept that a quarter century after the Second World War, the aggressor Israel and its men behind the scenes, he used the expression Hintermänner. Those of you who know German know that the Hintermänner was a noun that appeared frequently in Nazi propaganda. That the men behind the scenes form a Sinai protectorate or a general government of Jordan for a purpose of renewed colonial oppression of the Arab peoples. In subsequent decades, the association of Israel with Nazi Germany remained an enduring element of communist, Arab, Palestinian, West German, and West European leftist anti-Israeli propaganda. And as I noted before, that association survives down to our own times. The files of the East German Defense Ministry are fascinating. In the aftermath of the War of 1967, the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc engaged in a major program of rearmament of the Arab states and training. As Heinz Hoffmann, the defense minister of East Germany, acknowledged in a memo that he gave to the to the Politburo, the Israelis did not win the war because they had superior equipment. In fact, the Arab states, he argued, had superior equipment that the Vietnamese, he pointed out, were using quite well in Indochina. But the Arabs didn't know how to use it properly, needed to be retrained, and that was another aspect of the years from 1967 to 1973. The East Germans, and here and again in a talk, your eyes will roll over if I give you many, many numbers, but they sent thousands of Kalashnikov assault weapons between 1967 and 1970, 150,000 landmines, 3,500 hand grenades. To the Syrians, they sent T-34 tanks, machine pistols, hand grenades, and the like. East Germany was acquiring a reputation in the Third World after 1967 and Ulbricht's speech as not only a friend to the Palestine Liberation Organization and a partisan in support of the Arab states, but as a state that wanted to take a very high profile in support of left-wing communist national liberation struggles in the Third World. And more requests were coming to East Berlin for weapons and military training. So many that on September 30th of 1969, Willy Stoph, a Politburo member and president of the East German Council of Ministers, assigned another member of the Politburo, Gerhard Weiss, the deputy council of minister, to be the coordinator of weapons deliveries around the world to these organizations. Weiss's committee remained the center of that program of weapons deliveries and training for the next 15 years. One question, especially if we compare East Germany, say, to Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, is why did the East Germans take such a high profile? Why did they become so famous in the Third World? Why was the Third World so important for the East Germans? And the answer lies in my view, in the mutually reinforcing nature of ideological passion influenced by Marxism-Leninism, and national interest more conventionally understood. East Germany had a dilemma. And the dilemma was called the Hallstein Doctrine. And those of you who are familiar with West German diplomacy will know that I'm referring to a policy of the West German government which refused to have diplomatic relations with any state around the world that would have diplomatic relations with the government of East Germany. It was a conscious attempt to undermine, isolate, delegitimate the East German government. And so one of the key goals of East German foreign relations was to break the Hallstein Doctrine and to establish diplomatic relations with countries outside the Warsaw Pact. For reasons that I don't understand, Cambodia's Norodom Sihanouk became the first leader to break the Hallstein Doctrine, and that was a rather isolated example. But the flood that broke the Hallstein Doctrine came in the spring of 1969, and it came in the Middle East, and it was the result of the persistent efforts of the East German Foreign Minister Otto Winzer. That is it's a small photo, it's a little difficult to see. That is a photo of Otto Winzer in Iraq in 1969 on May 10th with Foreign Minister Abdul Karim al-Shikli. And they are signing, that follows a week of negotiations in Baghdad, in which they signed an agreement to establish diplomatic relations. And the two foreign ministers stressed their shared struggle against imperialism, neo-Nazism, colonialism, and Zionism, and described Israel as racist, imperialist, reactionary, and aggressive. The description of Israel as a racist state, an imperialist spearhead, and a state similar to Nazism was thus embedded in the beginnings of diplomatic relations between the two states and also in the political language of the Soviet bloc. Similar language accompanied the establishment of diplomatic relations between East Germany and the Sudan in June, Syria on June 5th, Egypt and South Yemen on July 10th. An increase in weapons deliveries of MiG fighter jets to Syria and Egypt followed. For the East German communists then, anti-Zionism was a matter of ideological conviction, but it also was an effective tool, the anti-Zionist card, we can call it, to undermine West German policy in the Middle East and to present East Germany as the good, that is the pro-Arab and anti-Israeli Germany. East Germany should be remembered as a state whose foreign policy was enormously successful. It was anything but an isolated country, and those of you who have looked at UN documents of the 1970s and even 80s and looked at the various resolutions denouncing Israel will notice time and again that East Germany is among 95 or 100 nations denouncing Israel's various crimes, while Israel is joined by the United States, sometimes West Germany, often Denmark, 5, 6, 7 countries opposing these resolutions. But East Germany was in the midst of this large majority. During these same years, the Soviet bloc as a whole deepened state-to-state military relations with the Arab states. Heinz Hoffmann was the defense minister of East Germany, remarkably from 1960 to 1985. And Hoffmann and Erich Honecker are the two key figures in the East German Arab, East German PLO alliance, along with leaders of the Stasi. About them more in a moment. In October of 1971, Hoffmann led an East German military delegation, which is on the left of this photo, on a trip to Iraq, Egypt, and most importantly to Syria. And that is a photo of the East Germans meeting, that is the military general staff, the admirals and generals of the East German military meeting their counterparts on the right of the Syrian military leadership. Syria, as many of you are well aware, was the linchpin of Soviet policy in the Middle East. So it's no surprise in that sense that Mr. Putin is so deeply engaged now. Hoffmann met with Hafez al-Assad as well as the chief of the Syrian general staff, a man named Mustafa Tlass. In the course of extolling solidarity in the common struggle against Zionism, Hoffmann observed that Tlass clearly expressed a tendency, quote, that existed among other leading officers in the Arab armed forces, unquote, namely, quote, an unconditional admiration for the fascist blitzkrieg strategy and the expert accomplishments of the bourgeois German military, unquote. Unfazed by Tlass's admiration for the Wehrmacht's accomplishments, Hoffman expressed confidence that the Syrians, quote, will be victorious against the enemy. We are fighting the same enemy, that is, the United States and Israel. The relationship between East Germany and Syria and between Hoffman and Tlass deepened in the following decade. The archives have a number of interesting reports about conferences and dinners and fulsome toasts, one to the other, awarding each other various awards. In the early 1980s, Mustafa Tlass published what really, and I am not exaggerating, was a vicious anti-Semitic tract called The Matzah of Zion. And it claimed that the Jews murdered Arab children in order to acquire their blood to make matzahs for Passover. He wrote that Europe had advanced economically because it persecuted the Jews and kept them in their place, while the Arabs and Muslims were backward because they had treated the Jews all too well. The Hoffman files document some warm toasts that he offered to Mustafa Tlass, but they don't indicate if after a few drinks, Tlass told him what he really thought about the Jews. I have not found any archival material that suggests that the East German government was involved in the Black September attack on the Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics in 1972. There was considerable document destruction in East Berlin by the Stasi officers in the fall of 1989. So, of course, we don't know what's not there. It's likely that the attackers spent time in the Soviet bloc, but so far, evidence of government involvement has not come to light. East Germany wanted the Olympics to showcase the accomplishments of its drug-enhanced athletes. It's hard to see what it had to gain with such an attack. It's the aftermath of the attack that is more historically important for understanding the history of East German antagonism to Israel and the alliance with the PLO. In the weeks following the Munich massacre, the recently deceased Hans-Dietrich Genscher, then West Germany's interior minister and future long-serving foreign minister, signed an order banning an organization called the General Union of Palestinian Students, known by its initials as GUPS. It also banned an organization called the General Union of Palestinian Workers, known as the GUPA. The West German authorities had gathered evidence that GUPS was an arm of the PLO, which sought to support armed struggle against Israel and possibly internationalize the armed struggle with a front in West Germany. One of the Palestinian publications in West Germany in the 1970s was entitled Die Front. During the Munich attack, the Black September terrorists called the GUPS office in Bonn. In the month after the attack on the Olympics, the West German authorities expelled about 300 members of the GUPS. They seized the GUPS property. They dissolved the organization. According to West German law, quote, organizations whose members or leaders are entirely or partly foreigners can be banned according to the law regarding such associations if they, through political activity, damage or endanger the inner security and public order of the Federal Republic of Germany, unquote. The West German authorities insisted that the GUPS and the GUPA were not banned because of their political ideas. People had the freedom to say whatever they wanted about Israel in West Germany. But it was a consequence of their willingness to use and support violence to achieve them. Genscher wrote that the decisive issue, quote, the decisive issue for the threat of the Federal Republic's internal security lay in the fact that the GUPS supported, quote, the methods of guerrilla war and of Palestinian organizations and did so, quote, not only on the territory of Palestine, but in West Germany as well. With the decision to ban GUPS and GUPA, the West German government decided that it would not permit its territory to be used for those purposes. It would not permit its territory to be used to plan or carry out armed attacks on the state of Israel, not to mention attacks on Jews in West Germany. In the next 10 crucial months, East Germany made the opposite decision. The West German ban of the GUPS opened an opportunity for East Germany to gain yet more favor with the Arab states, and it quickly seized it. It denounced the ban as an anti-Arab measure. East German diplomats in Beirut and Damascus had discussions with members of the PLO. Western intelligence agencies had viewed Black September as part of the PLO and linked to Arafat, a fact he denied. Yet on September 17th of 1972, he wrote to Erich Honecker, and he urged understanding, quote, of the action in Munich from the viewpoint of the general problem and its historical events, with all of their political, national, and human dimensions. If one wants to really distinguish between the deep causes and the peripheral and secondary events, it is futile and useless to view the action apart from the stream of events and from their whole historical framework. Yasser Arafat in September of 1972. In other words, Honecker understood that Arafat offered an implicit justification for the attack. He followed with a fulsome letter to an Arab People's Conference in support of the Palestinian Revolution taking place in Beirut. In the letter, he did not mention the Munich attack, but he denounced what he called Israeli aggression, that is, the Israeli retaliatory raids in southern Lebanon that followed the Munich attack. And this pattern of never mentioning the terrorist attack on Israel, but always then denouncing the unprovoked aggression that the Israelis engaged in when they responded to terrorist attacks, this became an enduring aspect of communist journalism and of the anti-Zionist impulse in world politics. Arafat had first visited East Berlin on October 30th to November 2nd of 1971 at the invitation of the GDR's Afro-Asian Solidarity Committee. On several more visits in 73, he met with Politburo members Hermann Axen and Gerhard Gruneberg. Gruneberg became the key contact person between the Politburo and the PLO. In August of 73, the East Germans celebrated Arafat at a major World Youth Festival. He and Angela Davis were the two celebrities. It was then that he held the first of many meetings with Honecker himself. And the Honecker-Arafat relationship is key to this whole history. In September of 73, East Germany became the first Soviet bloc state to open a PLO consulate in its capital. Mao's China had opened one in 1965. The Soviet Union opened a PLO office a year later in Moscow. The formal agreement of cooperation with the PLO extolled the common struggle against imperialism and Zionism, and Arafat signed it on August 2nd of 1973. The East Germans promised to deliver what they called solidarity goods in the civilian and non-civilian era. The euphemisms referred to weapons. Similar agreements for civilian and military deliveries were signed on an annual basis over the next 15 years. There was a lot of flying back and forth between Beirut and East Berlin in those years. The decision of September 73 to open a PLO office in East Berlin took place when the PLO, following its charter of 1968, was engaged in an armed struggle with the purpose of destroying the State of Israel. It was one of those events that demonstrated the vanguard role and initiative the East German communists brought to the anti-Israeli cause. The opening of the PLO office in East Berlin caused consternation in West Berlin, and especially consternation from Heinz Galinsky, a name that some of you may recall. Heinz Galinsky was the titular leader of the Jewish community in West Berlin. And one of the things that Undeclared Wars with Israel does is to bring the Jewish voices in West Germany and the Israeli voices at the United Nations into this story. They haven't been heard often enough. On September 1st of 1973, Galinsky, who was a survivor of Auschwitz, sent an open letter to Erich Honecker to express his growing concern and anxiety in the Jewish community about the establishment of the PLO office in Berlin. And I'll just read you part of it. With astonishment, we see that the stance of the GDR, German Democratic Republic, towards Israel is more hostile than other socialist countries. Now and then we hear from your side the assurance that you have nothing against the Jews, but it's only Zionism that you condemn and fight. We have had negative practical experiences with such theories. There is no doubt that the biased, uninformed, and hate-filled reporting about Israel in your press, radio, and television in recent years awakens anti-Semitic resentments. In so doing, it accords with the intention of neo-Nazi groups here in West Germany. And people such as yourself, and Honecker was also in a concentration camp, a Nazi concentration camp. People such as yourself who belong to the circle of those persecuted by the Nazi regime must be especially conscious of such efforts. It especially pains us that people such as yourself who suffered with us under National Socialism and fought against it foster such destructive emotions and sentiments. and he urged him not to open the PLO office, and Honecker did not reply to Galinsky's letter. But Galinsky was friends with Klaus Schutz, who was the mayor of West Berlin. And Klaus Schutz was not happy about the opening of the PLO office either. And neither was David Klein, who was our splendid State Department representative in the American consulate in West Berlin. David Klein, remember that name. They were convinced that Arab and Palestinian terrorists would fly from the Middle East to East Berlin's Schönefeld Airport, and that the PLO office would then aid their travel to West Berlin and West Germany and Western Europe. And as the four powers, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, had responsibility for ensuring law and order in Berlin, the issue of possible terrorist infiltration from East to West Berlin and West Germany rose to the level of the Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. On September 28th of 1973, in preparing a démarche to the Soviet Union, Kissinger wrote that the Western Allies had heard that among the activities of the PLO office in East Berlin will be the training of personnel for acts of terrorism, and that whatever its function, the PLO office in Berlin cannot help but introduce a new element of tension into Berlin and work against our mutual efforts to create détente. Kissinger wrote, "It is also in the Soviet interest to do nothing which might encourage terrorism or lead those who are inclined in that direction to believe they have support, tacit or active, of authorities anywhere in Berlin." And it is in this spirit that we ask the Soviet embassy to use its influence to keep the PLO office from operating. On October 25th, 1974, David Klein wrote a splendid memo which he read to his Soviet counterpart in East Berlin. So the Soviet Union was on notice as of the fall of 1973 that if there were Palestinian or Arab terrorists who arrived in Berlin-Schönefeld Airport or anywhere else in the Soviet bloc and then came to West Germany, West Berlin, Western Europe and blew things up and killed people, the CIA, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the Mossad, and who knows who else would probably be able to trace pretty quickly where those people came from, and that this would have consequences for détente and for the millions and millions of dollars that were coming from the West to Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And so if the Soviets wanted to retain the benefits of détente, they had better make sure that this merry-go-round out of West Berlin did not develop. The Americans did not warn the East Germans, probably because they may not have thought of it, against using East Germany as a base for attacking Israel. But the Soviets and the East Germans got the message. And this is where we turn to what I call the Stasi's dilemma. And perhaps if there are people here, it's a statistical possibility that there are people in the room who have experience with intelligence. This may sound not so crazy. What was the Stasi's dilemma? How do you support a terrorist organization like the Palestinian Liberation Organization without undermining support for détente in Western Europe? Already in October 17th of 1973, the Stasi wrote a report about the issue, about, quote, possible execution of acts of terror by militant organizations originating from an East German base of operations and possible activities of supporters living in the GDR. The officials in the Stasi's Central Division Number 2, the Counterterrorism Division, ordered expanded surveillance of the PLO office. As they wrote, quote, it could itself be the starting point of activities that would do political damage to the GDR. The Stasi had 4 GDR-friendly Palestinian organizations with members in East Germany, and they included 60 members of Al-Fatah, what the Stasi called the left-wing extremist group, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, with 20 members, 15 members of the Syrian-based Al-Saika, and 6 members of the Democratic Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine living in East Germany. And the Stasi memo expressed an enduring ambivalence toward these people. On the one hand, the communist regime welcomed them as part of the contribution to the global struggle against imperialism and Zionism, and on the other, it viewed them as a source of potential trouble, because if they carried on terrorist attacks in West Germany and Western Europe, that could be traced back to East Germany. Those actions would undermine East Germany's reputation as a peace state, a Friedensstaat, confirm suspicions that it was a state sponsor of terrorism, and thus endanger the financially lucrative benefits of détente. And these concerns were the beginnings of what I'm calling East Germany's Eurocentric definition of counterterrorism. And today, I don't have time to read to you the fascinating memos that emerged by 1978, written by Erich Mielke and Gerhard Niebuhr, the minister and deputy minister of the Ministry of State Security, the Stasi. But I can summarize them by saying that the Stasi's policy was to form a formal, written relationship of cooperation with the PLO's intelligence service led by Abu Ayyad. And the purpose of the intelligence cooperation was twofold. On the one hand, it was to assist the PLO with weapons and with military training, with hospital care, for some people with university educations, for many people with a year of German language training. So assist the PLO in its intended effort to destroy the state of Israel. And on the other hand, to use the knowledge of the PLO of the terrorist scene in order to prevent Carlos and the PFLP and Wadi Haddad and others from using East Germany as a base to attack the West. And in order to prevent these people from using East Germany from a base to attack the West, you had to know where they were, and the PLO knew where they were. So hence, on the one hand, aiding the PLO in its primary mission of attacking Israel, and after the Camp David Accords, also aiding the PLO in attacking Sadat, but then preventing it from attacks in Western Europe. And Arafat, as a brilliant Clausewitzian, understood that terrorist attacks in Western Europe, like the attack at the Munich Olympics, really did not help the PLO one single bit. And that what he was trying to do was to gain political support for the PLO in Western Europe. So the more things that blew up and the more people were killed that could be traced back to the PLO, the worse it would be for the political warfare that he was waging at the United Nations in order to isolate Israel, a kind of political warfare that he waged brilliantly and effectively. And these relations of cooperation are in written documents that are in the files of the Stasi archive. One of the great pleasures of reading the Stasi files is that when these high-ranking intelligence officers spoke to one another in the privacy of their own offices, they abandoned the euphemisms and lies that East German and Soviet bloc diplomats used at the United Nations. When there would be a terrorist attack in Kiryat Shimona or Malot or the Coastal Road Massacre, and Yosef Takua or Yehuda Blum or Abi Iban or Gideon Raphael would stand up in the United Nations and describe the PLO as a group of criminals, a terrorist organization, Peter Florin, the East German ambassador, would stand up and say, "This is defamation. This is slander of the Palestinian and Arab national liberation struggle against oppression and imperialism." But when Abu Ayyad was speaking with Erich Mielke and Gerhard Niebuhr in the privacy of their offices, they agreed that what the PLO was involved in was terrorism. And they didn't use resistance or the famous euphemisms that now fill the BDS resolutions. When they were discussing people who put a bomb in a restaurant or blow up a bus or throw children out of the third floor of an apartment building, as they did in Kiryat Shimona, they called them terrorists. And they said, if it's terrorism in the service of the Palestinian national liberation struggle, yes, we support it. So long, Mielke added, as it doesn't do damage to the national security interests of East Germany. A note about the Yom Kippur War. How much time do I have? 5 minutes, okay. Then I'm going to summarize. There's an irony about the Yom Kippur War. I defer to my Israeli historian friends about how grim things were in the Yom Kippur War, but certainly from the perspective of the White House, things looked very grim. And after the first week of very intensive battles, as you will recall, the Israelis were running out of ammunition. And so either they were going to lose the war or they were going to resort to their nuclear weapons. And Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, this was made very clear to Richard Nixon and President Nixon and Secretary of State Kissinger. And Richard Nixon then said, the Soviets are not going to win this battle in the Middle East, and the Israelis are not going to be defeated. Give them everything they need. And Kissinger then ordered that it be done, and it was done. And the United States engaged in something called Operation Nickel Grass, which was the largest logistical operation carried out by the United States Air Force after World War II, aside from the war in Vietnam. And that righted the military balance and made possible a negotiated settlement and prevented an Israeli defeat. All of the West European allies refused to allow American resupply planes to land in Europe, with the exception of Portugal's Salazar, and the planes could land in the Azores. Willy Brandt's government took the official position of the government of Willy Brandt in the Yom Kippur War was neutrality. There were Israeli ships in the harbor of Bremerhaven that wanted to load American weapons from American supplies at the Bremerhaven harbor. And the West German government said they have to get out of the harbor as soon as possible. If there are American ships in the harbor, we can at least fudge it, and nobody knows where an American ship is going. But if the Israeli ships are there, everybody knows that our harbor is being used to resupply Israel. And no, that's not possible. The tensions between the United States and those, if there are people here who are in the State Department or recall those years, the tensions between the United States and Western Europe were enormous during the Yom Kippur War. Kissinger was furious, and he was furious because he said the West Europeans didn't understand that an Israeli defeat in the Yom Kippur War would be a disaster for Western Europe. And didn't the Western Europeans understood that Israel's survival and Israel's ability to defeat the Soviet efforts in the Middle East were a front line that defended Western Europe as well, because the Soviets otherwise could get a hold of the oil supplies of Western Europe. But the Western Europeans, as you know, instead of seeing Israel as a state that served their interests, have often seen it as a pain. East Germany, on the contrary, sent weapons, 2,200 tons of weapons, a pittance compared to the 100,000 tons coming from the Soviet Union. It sent weapons in its own ships to Syria, tanks and heavy artillery, and its Air Force flew planes to Aleppo, sad Aleppo, flew planes to Aleppo, where they were then flown in combat by Soviet pilots. A word about Entebbe. There's much more to say, and I don't have time to say it. There's a lot of detail about Entebbe. But there are two things that I want to point out about Entebbe. Wilfried Böse and Brigitte Kuhlmann were not marginal figures. They had strong links to leading figures of the West German New Left. Now, those leading figures of the West German left, like Karl Dietrich Wolff, the founder of the Red Star Verlag, Joschka Fischer, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, were brilliant. And they had enough political common sense to know that engaging in terrorism was an absurdity. And so they stood back. They didn't take that next step. But what Böse and Kuhlmann did in Entebbe was a logical extension of the ideas that were floating around the Frankfurt left from 1967 to 1976. And I repeat, they collaborated with Idi Amin. It's one thing, it was bad enough to collaborate with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. But Idi Amin had the distinction of, as far as I know, being the one world leader in 1972, after the Munich attack, to have actually praised Hitler for carrying out the Holocaust. At the United Nations, I want to draw attention to the documentary record left by the Israeli delegation, by Gideon Raphael, Yosef Tekoa, Yehuda Blum, later even Benjamin Netanyahu, though his contribution came after the most serious events, Abba Eban. They left behind a massive and detailed record of Palestinian and Arab terrorist attacks on Israeli civilians. It is there to be found in the letters to the Secretary General and the letters to the President of the Security Council, which, with a little bit of expertise and using the hardbound volumes and even online volumes of the UN Yearbook, plus the online United Nations official document system, you yourselves can read, and I use them extensively. I am not a romantic historian, and I am not a historian who looks in search of heroes, but I have to confess, they're my heroes. They were outnumbered. They were outvoted. They were insulted. They were repeatedly defeated for decades. Israel's diplomats at the United Nations fought back. They reminded the world that this was not Warsaw in 1943, that the Jews had a state, and you had to listen. And they spoke eloquently and brilliantly. And I am indebted, we are all indebted, to the record they left behind. It is an irony of historical research that the records of the United Nations, which did so much to isolate and attack Israel, especially in the General Assembly, also contain these detailed records of hundreds of terrorist attacks. Just a brief mention of the Lebanon War and its historic significance. The Lebanon War is most famous for the misdeeds of Israel in Lebanon. It should be famous for some other reasons. It represented an enormous defeat of Soviet policy in the Middle East. Soviet soldiers did not rush into battle, but the communists, the effort to use the PLO to destroy Israel by force of arms failed in Lebanon. The expulsion of the PLO in 1982, with the assistance of the United States, which rescued the PLO, was a major blow against Soviet policy in the Cold War, and it should be seen, really, I think, as one of the turning points, beginning of the turning points in the Cold War. The other aspect of the Lebanon War, in the Undeclared War, that is important to recall, is the genocide charge. The Soviet bloc and the East Germans accused the Israelis of waging a war of extermination, a genocide against the Palestinian people, and that, too, became an enduring aspect of the anti-Zionist passion. Almost done. Given the secrecy that surrounded the East German weapons program, it's possible that additional arms shipments were recorded in files under code names or were in files that were destroyed in 1989. Weapons in East Germany's Operation Friendship program went to many leftist movements in the Third World, especially to Yemen, where Palestinian terror organizations had bases. Weapons shipped to these other destinations may have found their way into the arsenals of al-Fatah, the PFLP, the PDFLP, and others. Most of the larger weapon systems, such as tanks, MiG fighter jets, Katyusha rocket launchers, and artillery that East Germany shipped to the armed forces of Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Libya, were produced in the Soviet Union. But following the Politburo decision of 1969, East Germany's very modest arms industry began to manufacture its own version of the Kalashnikov assault weapon, hand grenades, cartridges, and landmines. The following is my approximation, based on the now available East German archives, of the total amount and kinds of weapons that East Germany gave as solidarity goods, free of charge or sold to the Arab states and the Palestinian armed organizations from 1967 to 1989. 750,000 Kalashnikov assault weapons, 120 MiG fighter jets, 180,000 anti-personnel landmines, 235,000 grenades, 25,000 rocket-propelled grenade launchers, 25 million cartridges of various sizes. In addition, during these years, East German technicians repaired and serviced 350 MiG fighter jets for the air forces of Iraq and Syria. From 1972 to 1989, more than 3,000 military personnel received training in East German military institutes, including several hundred from Syria, Libya, Iraq, and the PLO. A long list of other equipment with military purposes included binoculars, tents, parachutes, radios, field equipments, sniper rifles, carbines, fuses, explosives, and chemical warfare, which I could not find more information about, but there was a whole division in the Stasi that was devoted to weapons and chemical services. Perhaps in the files of the Mossad or the CIA or the Bundesnachrichtendienst, there are studies that trace the route of a Kalashnikov from a crime scene in Kiryat Shimona in 1974 or the Coastal Road Massacre of 1978 back to its factory or military unit in the Soviet bloc. Perhaps those still classified files have records of interrogations they traced the path of members of the PFLP from a military training institute in East Germany to the scene of a terrorist attack in Israel. What we do know now is that in view of this enormous amount of weaponry placed in the hands of groups, states, and persons who were at war with Israel, the East German government and the less important but more famous West German terrorists did indeed do much more harm to Jews and the citizens of Israel. Just a short word now, I know I'm speaking a little bit too long, about anti-Semitism. One West German Maoist, Joscha Schmierer, called accusations of anti-Semitism an old Zionist trick used to deflect legitimate criticism. In 1998, then Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer appointed Schmierer to the planning staff of the German Foreign Ministry. He remained in that post until 2007. I've concluded that for too many years, we have spent too much time trying to define who is and is not an anti-Semite, and too little time thinking about the consequences of anti-Zionism. First and most obviously, if, as was the case, one gives weapons and training to states and groups who are at war with the Jewish state, then it stretches credulity to say that helping to kill and wound Jews has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. Second, due to the remarkable reports of the BBC's Summary of World Broadcasts, there are abundant English-language translations of the virulent hatred of Jews and the celebration of terrorist attacks against Israeli civilians by groups such as the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. East German diplomats in Beirut and Damascus in the 70s and 80s could read and hear the gruesome celebration of attacks on, quote, enemy children, unquote, and the justification of Israeli civilians inside Israel as occupiers who were legitimate military targets. And one will read the pages of Neues Deutschland and the memos of the East German diplomats, which I have read from Beirut and Damascus, in vain to find any reference, any mention, any condemnation of a political culture of this Jew hatred. They did not condemn anti-Semitism when it was raw, public, and unapologetic. I'm glad to report that the reports of American diplomats in the region who are trained very differently, such as G. McMurtry Godley, who was our ambassador in Beirut, read very differently. Apparently, our American diplomats were trained, I hope are trained, to pay attention to facts and evidence. And Godley's memos, which I cite with pleasure, put to shame the East German diplomats, for he and others documented the celebration of terrorism in Palestinian political culture in the Arab press and media. This book should have been written long ago. There are several research institutes in Germany that are devoted to nothing but work on the history of East Germany. For them, it's a metro ride or a train trip to the archives I worked in. No jet lag. It doesn't speak well for our profession that it's 2016 that this book is being published, especially after what Konrad Weiss and Joachim Gauck and the other parliamentarians in East Germany did in 1990. Last, with Christian Osterman in mind, I want to say a note about the Cold War and Israel. While claiming that they were for a peaceful and just solution to the conflict between Israel and its neighbors, the Soviet Union and its allies waged and lost an undeclared war. Had the Soviet bloc and the Western terrorist left won the Cold War in the Middle East, the destruction of the State of Israel by force of arms would have likely been its result. Israel's victory in this war, its survival, made possible by its alliance with the United States following the Six-Day War, was an important and too rarely mentioned defeat of communist policy during the Cold War. Though West European governments have been reluctant to admit it publicly, to the great irritation in 1973 of Secretary of State Kissinger, Israel's victories of 1967 and 73, its defeat of the PLO's terrorist campaign of the 1970s, the expulsion of the PLO in 1982, were also defeats for Soviet Union's efforts to expand influence in the region and gain control over Arab oil that was crucial to the economies of Western Europe. It was not a member of the NATO alliance, but Israel's self-defense with American support was crucial for the security interests of NATO and Western Europe. The impulse in Western Europe to blame Israel for the continuing conflict in the Middle East was due in part to a failure to grasp the huge dimensions of Soviet strategy and the enormous debt that Western Europe owes to Israel, for having helped to turn the tide and shift what the Soviets called the correlation of forces around the globe, finally in favor of the West and against the Soviet Union. The Undeclared Wars with Israel reveals what remained hidden for too long. It's a challenge to my fellow historians of Germany, and I hope a stimulus to historians of the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and of the far left in Western Europe, to examine the strange history of the radical left's turn against the Jewish state in the last decades of the Cold War. It calls for some revisions in the writing of contemporary German history and of the connection between Europe and the Middle East in the history of the global Cold War. Thank you.
And now in our question period, if you would wait for the microphone to reach you. When it reaches you, please identify yourself and remember to use the microphone so everyone could hear. There's a woman in the back on my side on the right there.
Hi, Christy Makrakis. I'm a fellow at the Wilson.
Speak up.
It's on. Hello.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Christy Makrakis. I'm a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I had a question on the Stasi. Your presentation helped me understand how it was that East Germany, an alleged anti-fascist state, which would presumably also be pro-Jewish, made an alliance with the PLO and these Arab countries because of the Hallstein doctrine. My question about the Stasi is, from your remarks, it sounds like you were looking at internal files, Mielke, so Stasi, not HVA, not foreign intelligence. So my question is, I wonder, Marcus Wolf, of course, was partly Jewish, and so I wondered if you found any evidence or documents about his stand on this, because Mielke, would look at things differently than Marcus Wolf, presumably, who was partially Jewish.
Thank you, Christy. Her work, by the way, on intelligence history is important and fascinating. I think Marcus Wolf has gotten entirely too much attention, and his reputation is vastly overblown. Marcus Wolf had an incredibly easy job. The easy job was to take people who spoke German, looked like West Germans, knew everything about West Germany, and infiltrate West German institutions. No language barriers, no foreign accents. It was easy. And yet everybody calls Marcus Wolf a genius. It was relatively easy to do what he did. No wonder they were so successful. Marcus Wolf's preoccupation was penetrating West Germany, and he was able to do that. He was not involved, as far as I could tell, in the Middle East issues.
Actually, there is evidence that when I was doing my research, I found that, foreign intelligence had certain alliances with, and I always wondered with some of these Arab countries providing them, well, it wasn't just foreign intelligence, it was the operational technical services. Maybe they were provided them with equipment and things, listening devices and things like that.
Right, and that was run, as far as I could tell, out of the Division 22 in Gerhard Neiber's office, what they call Terrorabwehr, defense against terror. Wolf was certainly aware of all of this going on, that for sure. So you could let's turn it around. Given that he knew it was going on, why didn't Marcus Wolf defect to the West and blow the whistle on the whole thing? Marcus Wolf, who after 1989 wanted to remind everybody that he was Jewish, well, it was a bit late. He could have done huge damage to this program if he had decided to defect and blow the whistle. So I'm not that impressed with Marcus Wolf.
Yeah, Ross?
Ross Johnson, Wilson Center. Thank you very much. That's a very helpful overview. Most of the work on the East German side of dealing with the Middle East emphasizes their support for secret police and intelligence operations, which I guess was, as you say, out of Department 22. The broader, including the military aspects, important. I guess my question is understanding understanding your approach and accepting, the notion of the undeclared war, this was surely the undeclared war of the Soviet bloc. And so the question is, in focusing on the GDR, are you overemphasizing their sort of independent role, their agency? Presumably a lot of this was coordinated, and it was all coordinated, but a lot of it was presumably directed from Moscow. And I'm just wondering, in the early 50s, Czechoslovakia was the channel for Soviet bloc weapons to Israel in those days, pre-Suez. Later, 67 and later, perhaps East Germany was the most convenient channel for weapons to the organizations you've been talking about. So I just wonder what your reaction would be to that. And the final comment would be, along those lines. I don't think the East German rhetoric, the anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist rhetoric, was any more extreme than you would have heard at the end of the 60s coming out of Poland, for example, which created a whole internal crisis in Poland. And I personally heard Polish diplomats in those days speaking in anti-Semitic terms that one wouldn't have expected to hear in that time from such people.
Well, those are several excellent questions. I'll take them in order. I do emphasize in the book that the Soviet Union was the driving force. Overwhelmingly, most of the weapons came from Soviet factories. Only 3% of the weapons were coming from East German factories. According to some of the CIA reports, a larger percentage of the arms were coming from Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia than from East Germany. The point that I would make is that the East Germans did not need to be brought kicking and screaming to this policy. I have seen no internal documents or external documents that say, because of the Nazis, because of the Holocaust, let the Poles do it, let the Czechs, you do it, we're out of this one, right? We have this problem here. In June of 67, Albert Norden asked some Jews in East Germany, who were celebrities, writers, entertainers, would you sign a statement denouncing Israeli imperialism? And then a number of them said no. And the reason they said no was precisely that, because of the Nazi, what they called fascist past here, and the anti-Semitic history. But the East German, one of the things that I was struck by and wanted to explain was the passion and enthusiasm of Ulbricht and Honecker and the East German leadership. They, to use the expression, they punched way above their grade. And I think that what Otto Windsor convinced them of in 1969 was that this was the way to an enormous foreign policy success. The Poles, the Czechs, the Hungarians, they didn't have to worry about gaining diplomatic recognition outside, but East Germany did. And so it was a confluence of ideology and conventional national interest. This is working. We're becoming very popular. Yes, absolutely. The Soviet Union set the policy, and the Soviet language was, the Soviet Union was more radical in its anti-Semitism than East Germany was. The East Germans were a little bit more reluctant to talk about the Israelis as Nazis quite as frequently as the Soviets were, and they wouldn't make blatantly anti-Semitic slurs, or they wouldn't make fun of Israeli or Jewish-sounding names the way the Soviets would. There was a raw anti-Semitism in some of the Soviet propaganda, and so the East Germans would stand back a little bit from that. But I do hope that Undeclared Wars with Israel will stimulate historians of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. I think Russia is, getting into the Soviet archives now is going to be very hard, if not impossible. But it is possible to get into the Polish, Hungarian, and Czech archives, and there is a lot of work to be done in that regard. So,
actually, just a
I should give shorter answers.
Footnote on that. No, you're fine in your answers, even though we're quick on time. The Russian archives actually for the past year and a half have dramatically opened. You can now, for the Brezhnev period, for this period, see Politburo level international relations commission level documentation that was inaccessible in past decades.
Really?
Since the, so
How do you
you'll
explain
see it's surprising all of us, and you know, colleagues like Mark Kramer, who are specialists on this, have said they feel like a kid in a toy store. You can get, actually, as of yesterday, one of the key archives is closed again. But
You shouldn't have said anything.
in the meantime, some of the other archives are wide open, and there's actually a huge amount of top-level documentation that I think we'll see coming out, especially on this period. So there's a bit of good news, and the other piece of good news, just since you referenced the Cold War project's work at the end there, we just launched an initiative on archives and Cold War history in the Middle East. So hopefully more information, evidence, findings will come out of this process through the Wilson Center here and the Wilson Center's Cold War history project. But back to you for questions. Why don't we take Walter Reich, and we'll take several since we're actually running out of time.
Squeeze one in.
You'll squeeze one in too. Walter, go first. And
thank you, Jeff, for a remarkable presentation on history. One of the things you said just a moment ago was that you hope this historical work, informs other historical work on that period. But it also informs a contemporary understanding of the contemporary period. If you delete dates and names and events that occurred during the period you described, and dealt with this impulse regarding anti-Semitism as well as anti-Zionism, and applied all of that to the present, one sees something very similar. And I wonder if you could say something about that.
I have a quick answer.
let me take a few questions
All right.
on this. The gentleman down at the end there, and then we've just got one microphone today, so apologies. There you go.
Peter Ghiari, independent analyst. Just a few words, Professor, about the cooperation of relations between the Stasi and the Securitate, and was the Ceausescu regime also supporting the PLO logistically? You mentioned Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland. I was just curious about the role of the Ceausescu regime.
Thank you. And if you could reach behind you, the gentleman there. And
Jonathan Skolnick, UMass Amherst. Thanks so much. Your book is focused, of course, on the Soviet bloc and on the German far left. But I'm curious if you're looking to this period in the Stasi archives sheds any light on the far right. The Syrian regime is protecting Alois Brunner. The Israelis are able to infiltrate people into Egypt in the 50s as, rogue Nazis offering their assistance, presumably because that story is plausible. Is this on the Stasi radar, and is there new material on that in these documents?
okay, Eric.
So I want to turn this back to the New Left part of this story. And I know you're a German historian, and this is where your body of scholarship comes from, but I'm wondering to what extent this is a specific story to the New Left in Germany, or if you were to write a follow-up article about the anti-Israel turn after the '67 war, how universal could you make it? How many new lefts in how many countries followed the same path? Okay, maybe they didn't send people to Entebbe, but nonetheless, they participate in the rhetorical battles that you describe with such eloquence in this book. So just differentiate the German-specific part of the story from the larger universal New Left story, if you would.
Now may I speak?
Yes.
There was a review in the Times Literary Supplement about 6 weeks ago of some new books on the Middle East, and the reviewer ended the review by describing what she, I don't remember, called the new historical discourse of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Walter, I have been involved in opposing BDS resolutions and have followed anti-Zionist rhetoric in recent years quite closely, and I can say to you that there is nothing, not a single new idea in recent years. It's all old stuff. The difference is that in the 1960s and 1970s and 80s, it was world politics. It was in the United Nations. It was coming from major states and terrorist organizations, and now it has an academic loss. And I think that's the major difference. I don't know if the gentleman who asked the question about Romania is familiar with the work of my colleague Vladimir Tismanianu. Yes. And so I think you should send him an email. Vladimir, as many of you know, was, I forget, the director of a historical commission that studied the Ceausescu regime. And I'm sure, I haven't asked him specifically about that, but he would be the person who would be able to answer your question. I can't. The Stasi files that I looked at did not focus on the ex-Nazis who were in Syria. Jonathan, the CIA files do, and Richard Breitman and Norman Goda have a book that's readily available online called "In Hitler's Shadow" or something like that, which document that kind of thing. I would assume that just as Heinz Hoffmann knew that Mustafa Talas was in fact a very right-wing figure, that there were other East German diplomats, not just the Stasi, who were aware of ex-Nazis in Syria and in Egypt. The place, I think, to find some information about that might be in the files of the East German Interior Ministry, which was responsible for training foreign police forces. And there were former ex-Nazis who worked in the Syrian police in the 50s and 60s, and there might be information. But Breitman and Goda have some material on that. As for Eric Arneson's question, excellent question, one I've thought a lot about. After 1967, the New Left everywhere became hostile to Israel for the same reasons that the West German left did. Israel was imperialist, it was colonial, the Palestinians were anti-imperialist, Zionism was a form of racism. As a matter of fact, after 1952-53, it was very, very difficult to remain a member of the Communist Party anywhere in the world and be pro-Israeli after the anti-cosmopolitan purges. After 1967 and 68, it became very, very difficult to really remain a member of the New Left and be pro-Israeli. They two just were not compatible. To be in the radical left meant to think that Israel was a terribly conceived idea from the beginning and that it was illegitimate and that it should be done away with. That was the difference in Germany. The difference in Germany is that the conflict between Israel, the Arabs, and the Palestinians evoked a whole set of psychological and emotional complexes having to do with the German past that wasn't the case in the United States and Britain and France and other places. So the key figure here in unpacking your question is Dieter Kunzelmann, who was a leftist in West Berlin, and argued that the West German left suffered from what he called the Jewish complex. And the Jewish complex was that apparently there were all these young German leftists who were suffering terribly from excessive guilt about the Holocaust. And in order to make the revolution, it was important to get over this guilt and to understand that the Palestinians were the new Jews and the Israelis were the new Nazis. So that is all of this had a peculiar, psychological dimension in Germany that it didn't have elsewhere. That said, the there were only 3 major industrial countries that produced major terrorist organizations that continued to engage in terrorism in the 1970s, and that was Japan and Italy and Germany. And Italy was even much worse than Germany. The RAF killed 34 people. Something like 400 people were killed in Italy in the 1970s. It was just a mess. But and what they have in common, of course, is that during the war, Italy, Germany, and Japan were the Axis powers. So the youth revolt, the generational revolt, was deeper, and the turn to violence was more intense. But yeah, that would.
Thank you. I think we have time for just one more question over here, and then I think we'll have to leave it with that.
Mike is coming.
Yeah, Mike's coming.
Yeah, Ron Radosh, Hudson Institute. I have one question and one comment regard to Walter's question, and it pertains to the American New Left. I suddenly remembered, and I can't remember the guy's name, after the '67 war, what the group that really turned against Israel and engaged in anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist propaganda were black radicals, often coming out of SNCC. And I was on a television debate when Rutgers had a show on PBS. I remember Dave Dellinger was in it. I can't remember the name of this black activist, very well-known guy. I'm sorry I forget his name, but he was a very nice, friendly guy, and we took the train back together to New York and sat with each other, and he told me that his great passion, his great role was the fight against Israel, and he said that I and some others were put on the PLO payroll and consulted with them to get the propaganda we had to spread in the United States, and he said that he was actually paid for quite a few years by the PLO to engage in this work. And I believed him. Maybe he was bragging, but he was a very honest guy, and I suspect that was true. They immediately went to the black community for that. The other question I had of Jeff, is there any role that was all played by Fidel Castro in Cuba in sponsoring terrorism? I remember that Arafat came to Cuba to open the PLO embassy in Havana, and it was a big all-day celebration. And according to the book I reviewed by the former chief bodyguard and security head of Fidel's entourage, who defected to the United States, and ironically his book was published in this country the day he was killed, suspected to have been murdered, so there was no publicity for the book. He literally died the day the book came out. He said that one of the things he described was this one big encampment where people from every country, Palestinians, other Arab states, were all trained, largely by the Stasi, who advised the Cuban state security, trained in different areas for their terrorist work within Cuba and then sent back. Anything show up in that?
1 minute.
Ron,
1 minute.
I have nothing to say about Cuba, except that the Cuban representatives at the United Nations were close allies of the PLO, and one point that I found very interesting, and I hope younger historians will pursue, the military training institutes in East Germany and in the Soviet bloc brought together young people from all over the Third World, young people in their 20s and 30s, not so young, and they met one another. This was international communism. When we hear the phrase international communism, we think of Franz Borkenau. We think of Willy Münzenberg. We think of the famous figures of the Comintern in the 1920s and 30s. International communism existed during the Cold War, and it existed when these people from Vietnam and Cuba and the Sandinistas and the Syrians and the Palestinians and the Yemenis, they all sat in the same classes, learning how to shoot assault Kalashnikovs or learning German or Polish or Russian. girlfriends, boyfriends, whatever. These were enormously important networks. And as far as I know, very little has been done so far. But I think it's a very, very interesting and very important dimension. We're talking about thousands and thousands of people who received an education, for whom going to the Soviet bloc was upward mobility. It was seeing the world. It was learning other languages. It was struggling against imperialism. It was defeating Israel. It was fighting America. It was all of those things. And it's a very important dimension of the history of international communism and it was communism. It was communism. They understood it was communism. This wasn't democratic socialism. It's a chapter that really we've just begun to examine.
We could, I'm sure, go on for much time to come, but we cannot. So I have the unfortunate task of drawing this to a close. Next week, Jennifer Mittelstadt from Rutgers will be speaking on the rise of the military welfare state. Please join us for the reception. Please buy a book and get it signed. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to Jeff Herf.